Hi, I'm Jeremy Littlefield. I am a technical direction major.
I'm Josh Brown. I'm a sound designer and a composer.
I'm John Mitchell. I'm a lighting designer.
I'm Allie Hasselbeck. I'm a stage and production manager.
And this week we are going to go through the top 5 commented articles from Bover's Green page. First off, starting this week, we have CMU's Tepper Quad opens as a hub for collaboration and studying and socializing. This is basically going over the new building that has opened up and talking about how the space was renovated, or how the space was designed and built, and what the purposes and intents are for it. I think it's really cool walking over there, and it's very open, a lot of natural light coming through, and I think it's a place that you can see people going over to meet and to talk about different things and have a open discussion, because there's not really a place on campus for that, I would say, right now, until this building opened up, because I think the most diverse conversational spaces are open with a lot of seating were over in the main
Cohen Center.
the Cohen Center. And that seemed a little bit like there was more corners that you could hide in and discuss, not really an open floor plan. But
Yeah, it's been kind of amazing going over there a couple of times that I have, finding different people that I know from across campus that just randomly are there because they're enjoying a meal there or just having a good conversation and the openness that it does provide.
And it was interesting that that was part of the plan, that they actually wanted people to step outside of their comfort zones and like go meet other people who are not in Purnell or within what you are normally going to experience. And we actually, so for David Bover's technical direction class, my partner and I went over there just to do homework, like just to do our assignment. And it was really lovely because, yeah, it's open and there's food and there's people that you don't normally see. And like it's
sunshine,
sunshine, natural light.
how dare you?
But it was really great. It was a really nice space. The building was gorgeous. They have little console, like little screens outside all of the doors, and you can scroll through. It has all the schedule on it, so you can scroll through and see when it's booked and when it's open, and you can like book it
You can actually
right
book
there.
right.
Yeah,
That's nice.
it's really
They should
cool.
have that.
I know.
Booking this room can
It was
be
a
challenge
really good
sometimes,
idea.
but yeah.
So, but yeah, it's a really cool space.
yeah, that's I think that's really cool. And also, there's actually some decent food over there too.
Yeah.
It's a good change on campus because they did the whole revented the whole food on campus, but I think it's also great over there.
Only thing I don't know why I thought they did have there and they don't was bubble tea. I was a little disappointed, but you know,
Yeah.
just like suggestions
Yeah.
for
Very good.
Improvement.
good
Note to the
job.
designer.
It's awesome, and now I have bubble tea.
Yeah.
Great job on the building.
Bubble
Tea with
More tea.
bubbles.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Okay.
You can get everybody from across campus to go there.
And then in another event, Hurricane Florence getting ready to hit the coast. This is
Less
has
positive.
already hit the coast at this point, but this was in prep of it. A lot of theaters and film shoots that were going on in the area shut down production or postponed what they were working on in order to get people out of the area or just to make a safe working environment for everyone. I think it's really good that people are starting to take things more serious about nature. I think we learned a lot from the last hurricane that hit about this time last year in Texas, and the way it impacted the entire arts district there, greatly shutting down a lot of things and causing a lot of damage. And there are people that were stranded too in that, I think. So I think taking the proactive approach, leaning that way more often, I think is only going to do us good. But
Yeah, there's so much. I lived in Florida for 5 years, so hurricanes are like a thing.
just a little bit.
Just a little bit. We had Katrina, so that was fun. But the kind of blinders that you can have when you're in a very professional mode, especially for something like a film shoot, where everything is like scheduled to a T and you have all these people coming in and out, could potentially, for the people orchestrating that, be like, is it really going to be a bad hurricane? Can we just do it? And I think that the decision to actively say no, people's lives are kind of important, but also not adding to the kind of like clunk of infrastructure and evacuation, just like not having the people there in the first place. Being like, okay, this is going to happen, we're planning ahead, rescheduling things. seems to me like a wise choice for the most part, especially since hurricanes are getting much exponentially worse every year because of global warming.
It's also interesting, how you were saying, Jeremy, how last year they finally started taking notice. Even though we've had so many devastating hurricanes, we're finally starting to have some sort of change happen where they're trying to be proactive about, handling them.
Well, I think it's part of, until it impacts you and what you do or your industry, it's like, oh, it hasn't affected us yet, so why do I need to think about that?
Mhm.
A lot of like safety features that are standard in manufacturing don't really hit our industry until there's a major issue with it, and then it's forced into our industry. But
Yeah, and it's interesting thinking from like a scheduling management perspective, like how do you come up with plan B, plan C, plan D? You know what I mean? If we are shooting in the Carolinas, which is great because of the tax breaks and you employ a lot of
Yeah.
people and it's really great. But what happens if you have a giant storm and it's gonna derail your entire shoot?
And can you plan ahead for that? Like if it's not
Right.
already in the news, is there some imperative to maybe have a plan D? Like just like chilling in the background just in case?
How much of this can we do on a soundstage in LA?
Exactly.
and how much time does it take to implement that? Where at that point is it too late to pull the trigger on the backup plan of, oh well, we can't do this that we thought we were going to be able to do, because you don't like you were saying, you don't want to pull that trigger too late and say, okay, everyone go home or get out of here, because
Right.
then you're just adding to that congestion factor. So timing it out and having that plan thought out so far in advance that you then can implement it without causing more issue, I think is kind of key.
Yeah,
So.
absolutely.
Next article is foreign actors on Mexico's theater stage stir resentment behind the scenes by NPR. And Ali or John, you want to sum up what the article is about?
I mean, it's talking about Mexico having a big influx in the theater world there, and they had this first award ceremony, and a lot of the actors there were actually foreign actors from there. And a lot of it comes from is because in some of these other Latin American countries, because of how their economics are currently trending, they're moving to the places where they can find good work, and so it's starting to cause a strain on the theater scene there for others who are from Mexico and trying to work there, as others come in and are trying to make a living there.
So it's really just adding almost a competing sense in
Yeah.
that there's the locals trying to do what act, but then they have outside competitors essentially. But it's still representing the culture, but also at the time it's not representing the local culture or the local talent that is there.
Well, and I thought it was kind of sad in a way that they have to think about it in terms of, well, we're also going to be selling to the European and American markets, and what's going to look better. And it's like, oh boy,
Yeah.
that is a factor.
Well, and
it shouldn't be. It feels wrong.
It feels very wrong.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it was 7 out of the 38 that were nominated were from foreign countries. There's someone from Argentina, other places like that, and it's interesting that even in a place where they're all speaking the same language, these strains are starting to form, and hopefully it can be averted before it gets into something that can actually cause real turmoil.
Yeah, I know theater has a lot of input on the way people interpret things or the way people interact with the world, but I would hate to think that it's because of an issue with acting that it creates major world turmoil. I hope people are able to check themselves enough and not get to that point, but to even think that would be a possibility, that's unsettling for me. That's weird. And then I say weird for lack of a better word, but yeah, it's interesting how they're the diversity that they're trying to bring into it. And one thing that I did see in it, a quote was, we should favor the best talent possible, but we should strive for strengthening a Mexican theater industry. And that's not always going for the biggest name, that's going for who's best for it. That might be someone who hasn't been doing something before, but trying to keep it within the localness as well.
Yeah, and the question of diversity being that international communities are really interesting and obviously a diverse population, but the issue in this article, some kind of like direct quote, is that the sort of other Latin American countries tend to have taller, lighter skinned performers. So the kind of lens that you're putting into that is calling into question international diversity because of these kind of like global issues of colorism and like what that looks like in media. So there's this kind of like multi-level kind of melange of like diversity issues colliding, which is really interesting and doesn't really have a black and white like answer.
Yeah.
Really, there's no.
It's not straightforward.
It's more of an
Right.
observation and a more of like, this is happening. Do we do anything about it? Maybe not necessarily, but we acknowledge that it could be a possibility one way or the other.
And that actually goes into two of the other articles from this week where it was like, are you being represented? I'm still a terrorist in Hollywood's eyes, years after 9/11, where he talks about the fact that even like when it happened and even, you know, still now, he is being seen either as, you know, as a terrorist in movies where his culture is being used against him, or he is like Richard from down the street. And is there a way, of course there is there a way that he can have his culture and he can have his heritage and it is just part of who he is?
How can
And
that
it's-
not become the focal point for a reason?
Right,
A defining event, defining who you are,
exactly.
that you had no connection to.
And it's exactly what she was saying in To All the Boys I Love, too. It's like, and that one did do a fairly good job from what I saw. I did watch it, didn't love the writing, but it's a different story. But it's just who she is. She comes from an Asian American family, a household, and that's just who she is. And it doesn't cause any problems, and it doesn't cause, you know, like,
It's not the driving force behind the story.
there's no tension between her and the boy that she's interested in. It's nothing like
The
that.
story is the story.
It's just who she, yeah.
I want to go back to your point about like he's either a terrorist or Richard from down the street. That there's a difference in To All the Boys I've Loved Before that she's a ostensibly normal girl, but Richard from down the street is. I mean, first of all, there's the delineation of like side character, main character, but there's also the kind of innocuous tension in Richard from down the street that on the spectrum of like terrorist to Richard is like the innocuous, like sweater vest wearing, like good old American neighbor who just happens to be from like ancestrally from Iran or something along those lines. But the idea that, so I was 6 when 9/11 happened, so I'm fake, but in so much of the kind of Eurocentric mindset of America, the attacks really brought our attention to the Middle East in a way that I don't think was a thing before, from the wake of, you know, the Vietnam War, World War II. There's a global...
Yeah, Desert Storm before that, but that was like the most focus that we were ever there.
But this kind of shocked a culture into recognizing something through the lens of tragedy. So much of kind of like Muslim
Seeing it as a
and
threat.
yeah, there's something in the definition for a lot of Americans of like Muslims or Middle Easterners that is defined by 9/11, and it's reflected in the media because there are people who see that and they're like, oh wow,
It's immediately placed in a negative light because of how it's been shaped. Yeah. And it's, I cannot imagine. It has got to be horrible for him, especially the last 17 years. But like, what? Only because it wasn't thought of before. You know what I mean? Like, I guarantee you, it probably wasn't easy before then either.
Well,
But since then, it's immediately negative. It's not just
passive.
also, it doesn't say how old he is, so how much of his acting has been affected by it, whether he was in the industry before or if this is all he's ever known in the industry. But you know, the fact that it says 78% of the time they're cast as terrorists, soldiers, special agents, and tyrants. I mean, those are all either negative or shady stereotypes of people. So it's never in that positive light. That, you know, these people are positive. They're humans just like us. You know, there's always, you know, good and bad of everything. So.
And it's interesting because I don't think that it's always intentional, but the fact that it's unintentional and still harmful is the thing that I think needs to be worked on more in the country as well. Like there was a show, this is a couple years now, but it was literally called Tyrant. And it was about a Middle Eastern, like really wealthy, were they also, I think they were like the rulers of the country, and it was I think supposed to be about interpersonal relationships and familial relationships and all that, but because they put that skew on it,
because of how they cast it.
Because they put that skew on it, and it's like, oh, this is horribly, violent and denigrating to women, and you're like, oh my goodness. No.
Every negative stereotype people just thought, not never the truth or the reality of it.
Right, and it's both in the news and on like HBO. Do you know what I mean? So it's when it's reinforced every single place you go.
Well, I mean, so you have that, but then in the All Boys I've Loved Before, it's talking about how these roles are becoming more and more popular, and not necessarily popular as like, hey, it's always happening, where it's the latest craze. It's just they're positively increasing, and that's good. It's not like there's a huge drive to push it. It is just happening on its own, I think. And the fact that it's naturally developing, I think, means it'll last longer once people understand that this should be the norm and accept it as the norm. But there's not like a fight to make it the norm, I think.
Yeah, I really felt that with All the Boys I've Loved, is they're talking about they were wanting to cast somebody that wasn't, that was white instead of Asian, and in that realm, and they had to kind of fight and push back to be able to even have that role, just because it didn't matter. It was written in that sense of this is a normal person who that's their heritage, and that should be respected and kept within the writings.
Respecting the story.
Right, although it is interesting, and I think the writer even said it in there, the difference between All the Boys I've Loved and Crazy Rich Asians. All the Boys I've Loved, the only thing I worry about is that it's trying to be Richard down the street. It's trying to be, see, she can be American and normal.
She can be forced into that normal stereotype.
Right. Yeah. But like, Crazy Rich Asians maybe does a little bit better of a job being like, this is the family, and this is their circumstance, and this is about how this girl who has been raised in America goes back and is a foreigner in her home country because she is American. Yeah. She is the non-normal. She is the outsider. But because she's been Americanized, which I thought was interesting.
I also wonder to what extent the titles of these pieces change of how it's going to be perceived. Because, does the title Crazy Rich Asians make you think that, it's a story dedicated to that, and it's more of a one-off, not really, trying to set up a standard of this is just accepted fact, or this is accepted to have these type of people playing this role. I think there's times where, because like All the Boys I Love, that seems so, I guess, not tied to your automatic stereotype of what that person would be, that then when you see it, it does feel a little more natural, or a little bit more the norm, or what you would want to see in the world. Whereas Crazy Rich Asians, then I think that goes to force possibly bad stereotypes about that group of people.
Yeah. Although,
I mean, I think it just has the potential to backfeed on itself, depending on how it's marketed or how it's pursued.
But interestingly, like I didn't see Crazy Rich Asians. I saw All the Boys I Loved, right? So All the Boys I Loved sounds like a 1950s like picket fence, like you know what I mean? It's just like aw. And I didn't expect to have the main character be Asian American. and it was nice. It was a nice surprise.
Yeah.
And so I think that swapped expectations, title and content.
Mhm.
And from what I've heard, like friends of ours have gone to see it, and she said that it's actually really touching. And like Crazy Rich Asians sounds kind of, first of all, very offensive, and second of all, like frivolous.
Sounds like a reality show.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it sounds like.
But
Yeah.
apparently it was very good
Well
and very
received, yeah.
touching
Yeah.
and real.
I follow a kind of like radical femme Malaysian like social media reporter person who had a lot to say about Crazy Rich Asians and the idea of like watching Crazy Rich Asians when you are non-Chinese or non sort of like the lighter skinned Asian countries or ethnicities. Like you're watching it in America, it's more like, oh look, Asian people. But in specific cultures, it's more along the lines of like, you don't see yourself represented in like Chinese actors. You see yourself represented in like the darker people holding the door. And that was really stressful to me. I mean, as like a white boy in America. But
Trying to be aware, sensitive.
yeah, the idea of like diversity is not just kind of a one-off thing. A movie with a title like Asian people featuring all Asian actors is not inherently like a godsend of diversity because there are always sort of deeper issues, and media, if we take it on a face value, is like not the answer. It's not going to be something that we can sort of laud as like a moral high ground necessarily, because it's always going to be the average. And the average expectation of sort of racial groups in America is like Asian people, Black people, Latin Americans, white people. There's like these kind of boxes that exist, but the boxes have depth. And there's something that we're not getting when all we look at is kind of the face value product. There's always something deeper that is sort of festering and ugly that a lot of the times we don't get to see or have access to.
I mean, it's the definition of seeing the culture through a lens.
Yeah.
It is what the lens wants us to see, what the movie wants us to see of that culture, not necessarily the depth of what that could be. You know, the grime that's there. Yeah. But
And there's horrific colorism around sort of the Asian Peninsula area. There's like advertised, like we do not hire dark-skinned people.
Ooh.
Like
wow.
literally verbatim kind of things. It's just it's a whole thing. It's a whole big thing.
Definitely good to be talked about though, and like to have it be brought forward. And like it's not the solution, but having more representation and like is definitely a good thing.
Yeah, it's sort of the shallow spark to getting kind of approaching sort of depth of real world.
And you know, every culture takes longer.
Yeah.
You know, longer or shorter to adjust to, you know, what our progressive stance might be on something. So
When the culture is always progressing, like no matter what steps they take to progress, there will always be new steps created to then progress.
It's nice, as any other road.
yeah. And I mean, like even in another article, which is American Theater, Oklahoma's Still Okay, it talks about 2 different productions of Oklahoma, which are each interpreted or performed using non-typical casting in order to make a point or to make you think when you see the production. Yeah, I mean, I'm at a loss of like my brain is not on this article right now. It's still back
No,
where we were.
Jumping from where we were to
Yeah.
where we are. I mean, right? The theater.
It's not
Well,
culture, or it's not race necessarily.
No, it's LGBT
Yeah,
issues.
Yeah.
It's
But-
less of a cultural touchstone
yeah.
kind of thing. It's more of like
It's exploring our greater depth
people exist.
of
Yeah, I'm really interested in, as a like theater composer, I'm really interested in the gender and sexual binaries of singing in particular,
Mm.
and how very often you can kind of adapt like a straight play as like whatever you want with sort of like gender, race, and all these kind of casting decisions. But musicals and opera tend to have much more rigid structures, especially
Sing the part.
yeah, exactly. You have to like
The
physically
note is
be
the
able
note.
to do it.
Yeah.
So recasting two characters sort of gender swapped to make LGBTQ couples is interesting because then you're also making compromises with the music necessarily because voices are a thing. Some people, some like masculine bodies can hit feminine notes or whatever, but it's much more rare and might not be what the composer like wanted for their music. So it's a much more, to me, it's a much more interesting question of like the good old-fashioned American musical, which
Rodgers and Hammerstein.
yeah, which like is super gay. American musicals are like a gay cultural touchstone, but the ability to infuse that into actual stories is interesting because most of the touchstone there has been like the like grand dames, the like amazing powerful femmes that have been in these sort of things. So kind of turning it on its head rather than from the community being like, oh wow, the piece is reflecting back at these people, at us, for I am a gay. Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of sort of like structural and also societal issues at work.
And I think it's interesting to see works done like this because it again forces you out of that norm of going to see the Oklahoma you're expecting to see and then being challenged in an unexpected way. Because you think you've seen the story, and this shows that with small changes, the story can challenge you in new ways. You know, the issues of, you know, Curly, you know, killing off, what's his name? The other character, yeah, Jed. Yeah, you know,
Like, I don't know the
Jed
show,
basically
but-
dying off in the show. Like, that is now represented in a new way. Like, that's not necessarily the main driving issue that some people will see coming and seeing this. For those people who are used to those stereotypical gender roles, it is challenging that thought process and, you know, making them see things in a different light, I think.
Especially because musicals specifically are things that like high schools put on musicals all the time. Like you know a musical if you know a musical. It's the same thing all the time.
Right.
You might know like specific singers that you're like, yeah, they did it right. Like cue alphabet compilations or whatever. But like the challenging of recasting and remixing musicals is particularly interesting because people are familiar with the material. And there's an expectation the material is always just going to be the same. Like you're always going to get the tone
Especially in
number you
operas.
want. Yeah.
The whole culture.
And unless it's written in, unless
Guess
it's,
it's the link.
unless it's written in, unless it's like Chicago,
Yeah.
or Hairspray, or yeah, like unless it's written in, you're not expecting that. And you're right, like people swap gender roles on Shakespeare all the time. Like that's not.
But also that is so those you know, there's not rights and royalties you have to pay to Shakespeare.
Yep.
True.
There's not that issue that you have to consider of author's intent as much. Like you have to consider that as far as, you know, yes, the story, but you're so free to change it because it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in terms of like, how do we physically do this? Like, what are we going to do this? Because it's important that we do this. People aren't going to expect it, and it's going to be a really good thing for them to experience and then go talk about later.
Yeah.
Like, but yeah, it's definitely a thing that more theaters should take the initiative and time to do correctly.
And then we have
Talk about
oh
theaters
boy.
doing things correctly or
Doing things that they
incorrectly.
should do.
We all just moved away
We're
from
like,
the article.
Move back away from this one. But the American Theater again has another article of when damage is done, and this is talking about the outcomes of all these Me Too movements or the Me Too movement in general, and when it does hit home to your company, and basically not necessarily the fallout, but like in a good way, the fallout and the changes that need to come because of it, and how to initiate and work with those changes.
Yeah. So it's been
Tell me how you feel.
So, it's interesting, right? Because it's not always just a black and white easy answer thing. You're young and you want to move up in the company. You need so and so's backing in order to get where you are going. It's never a straightforward, easy thing to say, this is wrong, this should not be happening. It's the right thing to say when stuff like this is happening.
In that moment versus hindsight at it,
Yeah.
Cool.
And especially when the lines are not as clear, when it's not when she's talking about Les Moonves in the next article too, it's like it's not always explicitly awful. It's a comment that you go
it's the cringeworthiness of
and
it.
you walk away, and later you're telling your friend and they're like, whoa, what?
That's not okay.
Right? But it's not always obvious, and that's where I think, because I don't think any of these theaters, I don't think the Alley, I don't think the Guthrie, I don't think any of them meant to perpetuate this. None of them were like, you know what he's doing is right, we're just going to let him keep going. What he's doing is shady and not always nailed down in a very tangible form that we can track, and should not have kept happening, but it's hard, and it's hard to be the one who's like, artistic director, you're going from the top of the list, you're not talking about someone in the middle that you're like, yeah, you really can't do that, but you need to go, and yes, it's going to incur some damages to us and some losses, and we're going to have to rehire someone, but it's going to be okay. Artistic direction of the theater is going to change.
And I think a lot of it, the reason why it seemed like all of a sudden all these things are coming out across, all this film and theater entertainment industry is because it took one domino to fall. As soon as one situation was able to stand up to that person that was in such a high place of power in the company and say, no, this is wrong, and you're wrong for doing it and perpetuating it, it just made it happen again and again and again and again, which is why it seemed to be like all of a sudden all these companies have these major issues. Not that they all happened overnight or all happened within the same month or two. It's just everyone had enough at the same time.
And part of it is that it's always top down, which is also a reason that no one was like, ding ding. Because when you, as an individual, particularly in the Moonves article, when you as an individual can just personally be like, nah, or you're the artistic director, and there's no one in the company that can check you necessarily. If you're talking,
checks and balances are there for a reason.
If you're talking to an assistant dramaturg or something, you can be like, listen, Molly, that was not okay. But when it's the artistic director or the executive producer or whatever,
or member of the board,
there's a higher weight of proof to de-seat them, which is really stressful in these situations because a lot of people are very conscious of everything they're doing, and there's sort of a rhetorical nature to I'm going to keep you in your place. You're never going to work again, but maybe you will. Or why would I cast them if I don't want to fuck them? As is a quote. These ideas of the people who are disenfranchised by this person in power, needing a weighty instrument to throw at them, because there's not the check in the company to be able to go to someone and say, hey, this is an issue. Can you personally wield your power or something to make this happen?
Well, I mean, in a couple of these articles, they talked about the board of directors didn't even know because they swap out so much more frequently than an artistic director. He's the constant person there, so they don't come across this. And so now a lot of the theaters are implementing these processes.
And that's what this article is focused on, is once you find out there's that damage,
how do
you prevent it? How do you address it?
And I was amazed. One of their steps was that they're going to give their human resource officer an office instead of a corner where people could overhear. And I thought, for me, it was that's a red flag of, hey, that should have, why would you put someone who has confidential conversations where anyone can hear them?
And I also think it's bad that it happened, but I also think it's good that it happened at such a well-known place, not, who's its little music theater
Right.
down the way. But I mean, because it was such a large thing, that means everyone was able to look at it and say that could happen here too.
Or see the similarities that might be already happening.
Correct.
Which is,
And then, for instance, during the summer stocks, a summer stock we work at this year, they implemented a anonymous reporting device so that you could go online, anonymously report an issue, and depending on the severity of the issue, there were people that were not the people that you work with every day, and like far outside of the company that got those email reports. They were sent to multiple people, and those all people are held accountable to that. And if it's at a certain level, that's the point where they're able to start stepping in and making changes.
Yeah, the exterior check is so interesting because, like, again, it's the artistic director, and everyone's just in the theater all the time. It's cultural, but when you have someone outside who can come in and be like, "We have the authority based on X, Y, Z to bring this to your attention," that anonymity too is such a powerful tool in that, because you can be able to have some comfort. And if something, there's so much kind of downplaying of like, oh,
That's not really what he meant.
yeah, or like, oh, he only tried to kiss me, there was no tongue, like always kind of tamping things down. So maybe being able to anonymously report kind of like makes it easier and facilitates those kind of like, oh, this was not okay. Right, done.
And like you said, the outside perspective, because so many times I've heard, oh, well, that's just how he is. And I don't mean,
the character is not the excuse.
Also, no, but this is horrible. I don't mean to use gendered pronouns. Oh, this is how person is. Oh, that's just how they are. That's not an excuse. Look at what they are doing.
Yeah.
And it sometimes takes that outside perspective, because whether people are intentionally turning a blind eye or just don't know about it.
Yeah.
Or just they're busy and don't want to, make a fuss.
Yeah. Yeah, we kind of touched base on that one.
Group the two and just
designing women creator. Basically,
it's in that same realm.
Same realm, and just ignoring it doesn't make the problem go away. It doesn't fix the issue at heart, and makes you responsible for ignoring it too.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Completely.
Complacency in there being a problem does not excuse the problem.
And the implementation of like walking people through stuff in stages, or like the first day that they get to rehearsal, this is what we're doing, this is how we're addressing it, this is we're going to talk to them, and I think that's really important.
Going on to these next topics, which are a
little bit lighter heart now.
Like a complete
And now
turnaround.
to blue.
Quantum blue and how it can help you. It's talking about this new type of paint they're developing, and it's working with UV light. And what happens is, what was interesting is I was reading this, now that I look back down the article, it talked about how the white, like when it doesn't have the UV light on, it looks pretty darn normal, like a little bit of a tint of blue in the white. And the minute you turn on, it's supposed to have one of the richest blue colors that's out there. And it's just fascinating how technology is.
It just reflects those right wavelengths of that UV that just make it pop.
And it's interesting. It's great how technology is now assisting us more and more in being able to create things as artists that can get more richer and help us tell stories in a different way and approach things in a much more unique and creative manner.
And also it being a collaboration is interesting to me too, that you don't need to be a scientist to leverage all of the scientific resources that we have in like the world now. So I'm all for scientist and artist pairings, because there's always a deeper understanding you can get from a scientist has a really microscopic view on a really specific thing.
Focused in.
And if you ask them about it, they'll light up. Artists have much more broad kind of skill sets. And when you combine those, you get both the depth and the breadth of something that could be really interesting.
And I just think it's cool, on a much lighter or broader note of the fact that we're still discovering new colors and creating new things.
But it was wild that the time before that was like 200 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
We've just
crazy.
been going on with what we got.
Yeah, no, that's fun. And when he said that they're gonna, he's like, I wouldn't be surprised if they put it on jewelry. how wild would that be?
Right.
Like, you just walk around with a watch, and then, like, the lights turn off, or,
And it
like,
just
something.
changes.
But then they have to include lighting in it.
How much more are we going to start installing different
Mm.
types of wavelengths into our normal lights
Yeah.
that can then help these things pop?
Yeah.
Having a UV come out and then something pops just a little bit more
Mhm.
as you're walking
Yeah.
around in the place.
Fashion designers now dictating more of the lighting of what they want, how they want things to react.
The exercise of like a space designed to show off status is interesting.
Yeah.
Of like, oh, I
Yeah.
have this blinged out blue watch.
Designing your foyer in your house to show
Yeah.
off your dress more so.
But like, almost like, what's the word? Facilitating humble brags.
Yeah.
Oh, what time is it?
Right? Well, it's like also a lot of architectural lighting or even museum display lighting having to now be aware of things like this in order to properly light the intended effect.
Well, then how's jewelry stores who might start installing this and like, oh, that looks great now. You take it home, it's like, wait a minute, that doesn't
Right.
look anything like what I
Yeah.
bought. What's going on here?
Just really dulled down.
Well, but like you said, then that would include building in lighting somehow.
Mhm.
So if it's in a watch, it's in the face of the watch, and
Yeah.
this, yeah,
Ding.
right?
A little glow in the dark makes it glow
Nighttime
really.
mode.
Yes. Oh, that's
Right.
my favorite.
Glows really well at the club.
I mean, honestly, yeah.
Oh my god.
And then lastly, this
Yeah.
week we have 5 structures for helping students learn project management. And one thing I really liked about this article is it went through, like, as someone who is learning, project management, it's not just focused on, 5 tips and tricks when managing a project. It was techniques in ways to help those instances click or teach those methodology and actually help it become more ingrained.
Yeah, the guy they were talking about on it, he was giving some examples when I was reading the article, and he was discussing how he was trying to set these goals for these students, and then he was trying to be like, well, they're struggling with this, so I guess I should extend it. And he started to learn over time that no, you don't. You let them learn that they have to keep these
A
deadlines.
deadline, not everyone loves deadlines, but everyone needs
Needs.
deadlines.
Yeah, because once you do it once, things
learn
are
you can
getting
do
better
it.
and better. I mean, just going from the first year of grad school to the second year of grad school on
Hello.
deadlines, it's like everyone becomes because everyone's getting reoriented back again into school for a lot of us who have been out of school for a bit. And as we start to re-enter this framework, it took us a second to be like, oh wait, it's a different deadline that I'm
This is how
not
I
used to.
student.
Exactly.
This is how I do the learning thing.
But then the other thing that I love about the article was it talked about that practical examples, right? Theoretical things mean nothing if you can't practically like, oh, this actually has an actual influence. If you don't complete this, something actually doesn't happen.
Yeah.
You're actually having issues with it.
Well, when we talk about this in TD1, and, and it's, yeah, if you don't meet that deadline, there goes a day of build or a day of loading, and it's like, sorry,
Time.
like, and you have to complete it. You're not just gonna have a half-finished set on stage.
At some point, things have to start going away. There has to be compromise at some point.
Yeah.
And those are because your failed actions.
Well, but that even can be a good thing, because then, hey, priorities.
Yeah, right?
And what are you gonna do? as a
Reshuffle those
team?
priorities, and you have to constantly reanalyze your project for what those priorities are. You can't just say, okay, these are my priorities on a list. Great, I'm going to leave them there. You have to come and constantly say, okay, well, we're here in our time frame. That means all of a sudden this takes more precedent, because if I don't get this ordered for this, then that won't be able to happen now.
And the
think-
transparency of that too, that other people know that if you don't do something, something else doesn't happen. And sometimes that something that won't happen is someone's entire job.
Yeah.
Which, like, if
Mhm.
you're not conscious of that, puts a lot of weight on your shoulders that you're not anticipating or dealing with. And your actions then influence other people. And you should be aware of that and be made available to be aware of that.
Yeah.
Well, it also talks about, it has different ways of doing, like different suggestions, and that's what they are. It's because each person is going to have a slightly different approach to project management or how they approach something, trying to manage their time, because each person thinks differently.
Mhm.
And so being flexible on that also, when you're trying to teach someone, it's not this rigid, you have to do it this way. This is a way that works. Does it work well for you? this is when you need it done. Make sure that fits. Learn how to adapt into these different scenarios because each scenario approach is different because each one have a different effect. You can have someone where their job is severely there's a severe struggle into their job now because you were late on the deadline.
Yeah, so I direct an opera festival at CMU in the fall, and we're right in it. But it's very much very much like we have a skeleton of things that work and like deadlines that need to be met, like casting and rehearsals and tech and whatever. But we have 8 shows from like 15 to 30 minutes, all operas, and there's a level of like personalizing that happens to each of those shows because like they all have casts and they all have directors and conductors, but some of them will have directors who kind of just like don't do much, and some of them will have directors and design teams. So there's a level of like, if you can structure within this skeleton well enough, you get an extra leg up on production, and if you don't, you get something. There's very few failures.
It will happen.
Yeah,
The show will happen.
There's few failure states, but at the same time, you're compromising other people's ability to be involved and to augment something in a way that only they could bring because you don't have the time or the energy.
Well, one thing I've heard said is, the opening date doesn't change.
Yep.
The quality of what is opening may.
Which, right, and which, I mean, in our world, that's kind of fudgeable. Like, yeah, it could. It's not happy.
No.
It's not pretty.
No.
But it could. Spider-Man musical. But
Not using the educational environment to do these things.
well, right, and I think also, I mean, because there's like a whole, hey, we're learning. Like, there's some error built in that like it's just gonna
Just a
happen.
school play.
And
Sometimes it's
failure
just
can be so educational.
Yeah.
Which
Yes.
the thing is, in educational institution, you have more leeway to change things. Like if you just cancel a show, you're not necessarily going to have angry patrons burning down your theater.
and you're not gonna lose $1 million. Like,
Yeah, but like canceling something in an educational setting means there are problems. Like
right,
yes, you
right.
have the leeway to do that more
Mhm.
easily, but there's something in not even allowing people to fail of like this will be damaging. That just
It is a negative output, not a
Yes.
positive output.
which is such a thing to confront.
Yeah.
That you don't want to.
And I think the skills of learning project management in our world are so wonderful. Like, you can go do anything. Like, really, though, you can manage pretty much anything after you're like, okay, these are our goals, and this is how we would like to do them.
Mhm.
Every single day, I think I rewrite a new checklist because priorities
It
change
change.
and where you
Things
are.
get added, things fall off.
And, you've broken down the tasks and set the deadlines, but
An email comes in.
you're right.
You're done for.
Ding, ding.
There's always someone who, like, I've always found there is always someone who has the ability to put an overriding priority on my checklist. And
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have control of that.
Yep, and then you adjust.
And that has to get done.
And you keep
Yeah.
going, and then somehow in the end it all happens.
Yeah. It does work
Like
out.
90%, 99%
Yeah.
of the time. But it's
Oh.
such a good skill set to have. So good.
So that's this week's articles. Tune back in next week for the next top 10. And if you really like something on the green page and articles, go ahead and comment on it, and that might reach up towards the top. See you next week. Bye.